Daf Zayin Amud Beis will begin Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, 4 lines from the bottom. We were discussing the machlekes of Nachman Rosheshes. Do we say Tuma Hutra B'tzibur, like Rav Nachman says, that if it's a korban tzibur, a korban shezman kavua, it's a set time, that if there is Tuma, it's treated as the Tuma is not there, and therefore one can go ahead, even l'chachila, to be makriv the korban. Or do we say, like Rav Sheshes said, Tuma is duchuya b'tzibur, it's only reluctantly. And if we have another option, if we have an option to do it b'tayra, then we do not do it b'tuma. Meisver, the Kashan Rosh Hashanah, you're saying that Tuma is duchuya and not hutra. It says, V'nosa arnas havayna kodeshim. It says, the Arnakaini has the tzitz on his forehead, and he will bear the avoin, the avera of the kachim. So he'll cause the avera, cause the korban to be accepted, notwithstanding that there was some pagam in it, there was some defect. It'll cause the korban to be accepted. So which avera are we talking about? Which avera are we discussing that the tzitz is maratza, that it brings about forgiveness? Which avera does it bear? Im avan pigul, if you say it's the avera of pigul. Now in this context, as Rashi says in several places, even though pigul normally means that he does the avodah with a machshava to eat the korban or to be makrivit chutz l'zmanai, here we mean that it is chutz l'mekaymai. So he did the avera, he did the avodah with the machshava, with an intent to eat it outside its proper place, or burn it outside its proper place. The korban is possible. So perhaps you'll tell me that the tzitz is maratza, it causes forgiveness and acceptance for that avera. Harek v'nemer lo yeratza. It says no, lo yeratza. It says by pigul lo yeratza. Ve'im avain noiser. Perhaps you'll say it's the vine of noiser. Now here again, it's not the typical normal meaning. Noiser normally means it's not something that has any connection necessarily to a wrong intent. It's even a korban that's kosher, that if in fact it was left over beyond the time limit, it's nicer and has to be burnt. But that's not, but it can't mean that in this context, because if the korban was kosher, whether it's left over or not, when it becomes nicer or not, it doesn't retroactively passel the korban. It's not a psul in the korban. So we must be talking about something here that affects the validity, the kashrus of the korban. So therefore, the nicer in this context means he did the avodah with an intent to eat it or burn it on the mizbeach beyond the time limit, which in that case the korban becomes possible. Perhaps you'll tell me that the tzitz is maratza for that avera, and it gains acceptance for the korban. The korban should be kosher. No, it can't be. Harek v'nemar lo yechoshev. It says lo yechoshev. It won't be considered. So therefore, it's not maratza for that. So what avera is it that the tzitz is maratza? That the korban would have been possible, but the tzitz causes it, gains it acceptance. All right, it's the avera of tuma, that if the korban became tome, the tzitz is maratza and it gains acceptance, it becomes kosher. Why do I say that it's tuma? Shehutra miklal b'tzibur, because we find that tuma is hutra miklal b'tzibur. We find that if it's a korban tzibur, and the tzibur is tome, that the korban is accepted. So we have a precedent. We see in a case where it is hutra, that it's accepted. So therefore we should say over here, in this case, even if it's not a korban tzibur, we should say that the tzitz, that's what is referring to, that the tzitz is maratza. And the Stasis points out, it's specifically for a tuma, because we see by tuma that it says that it's maratza, and the pasuk says l'rotzai. The pasuk says that by the tzitz, v'haya al metzach ha'arayin, and it says v'haya al mitzvah tamil l'rotzon lifnei Hashem. So it means looking for something that's specifically that there is a rotzon, it gains acceptance. Then and we see that by tuma, that is hutra meklal b'tzibur. It's hutra b'tzibur. So therefore, the tzitz is maratza even on the tuma of a korban yachid. But al kol panim, what do we see over here? We see that it says tuma Hutra Miklal Betzibur Kashal Risheshis Kasal Risheshis, who says it's only Dechuyam. More answers, Tanoi. Yes, it is true that this Tana holds to Mahutra Betzibur, but it's in fact the Machlokes Tanoi. The Sanya we learned in the Brisa, Tzitz Ben Sheyesh Al Mitzvah Ben Sheyesh Al Mitzvah Maratza. That sits whether the Kohen Gadol is wearing it at the time. So which time are we referring to? Rashi says at the time where the korban became tummy. If he was wearing it at the time of tumah, whether he was or wasn't, the Yad Roman Sanhedrin says that it's not referring to the time of the tumah; it's the time of avodah. Whether the Kohen Gadol was wearing the tzitz at the time that the avodah was done betumah. In either event, we say whether he was wearing it or not. Tzitz ben sheyesh al mitzvah ben sheyesh al mitzvah maratza, it's maratza divrishim, and this Rishim says that in order to effect the acceptance for the korban, the Kohen Gadol does not have to be wearing it at the time. Rabbi Yehuda he says no, ideal mitzvah maratza. If he's wearing it at the time, it's maratza. Ein ideal mitzvah in maratza, but if it's not maratza. Rabbi Shimon says, I'll prove to you that that's not the case, that I'll prove to you that it can be maratza even when he's not wearing it, because we see Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur Miyachiach. The Kohen Gadol doing the Avodah Yom Kippur will prove to you otherwise. Why is that? Shein Ideal Mitzvah Maratza. When he does the Avodah Spanim, when he's Lefnaim, he wears only the big day Lovin. He wears only the 4 begodim. He does not wear the tzitz. And nevertheless, it's maratza. Nevertheless, when in that time he would be maratza, even though he's not wearing it. So we see that he doesn't have to be wearing it in order to be maratza. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not a proof. Hanach l'kayin gadol b'yom kippurim. Put that aside. Shet tuma hutra lo b'tzibur, because that's considered a korban tzibur. That's a korban tzibur on Yom Kippur, so it's tumah hotel b'tzibur. So whatever he does lifnai v'lifnim, that's considered to be a korban tzibur, and it's hotra. So you don't need the tzitz. So the tzitz is not needed. But where the tzitz is needed, I'll tell you that it's only where he's wearing it. Mechlal the Reb Shimon Savar tumah dechuye b'tzibur. So it's Ma'al Mechlal, the Rosh Shimon, who brought the Raya, that he holds that even by a korban tzibur, that if it's Tomei, it gains acceptance only because there's also a tzitz. And now if the Kohen Gadol is not wearing the tzitz, you see that it's maratza. So you see that he does not have to be wearing it, but at Kol Panim, you see what Rosh Shimon holds, that even by a korban tzibur, even on Yom Kippur, to gain acceptance, it's not enough that it's a korban tzibur, you also need the tzitz. So that shows you that tumah dechuya b'tzibur. It's only reluctantly that it gains acceptance. So we need it also with the tzitz. The tzitz has to be part of it to gain the acceptance. Rabbi Yehuda holds that tumah hutra b'tzibur. So we see it's a machlokes tanai. So now we happen to mention this machlokes, whether the Kohen Gadol is maratz only if he's wearing the tzitz at the time or not. So we clarify this machlokes. Amar Abaye ben nishmarat tzitz kol yamalei plegi delei maratz. If the tzitz is broken and he can't wear the tzitz, everyone agrees that it's not maratz. Everyone agrees that in that case it's not maratz. Ki plegi the tal b'sefter. The machlokes is when it's intact, he could wear it, but he's not wearing it at the time. That's a machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda Savar, Rabbi Yehuda says he holds, the pasuk says, Al Metzach v'Nosa. It says, it'll be on his forehead, and it'll be Nosa, it'll bear the Avoin, the Avera B'nai Yisrael. The pasuk says, V'hel Metzach Aaron v'Nosa Aaron Tzavon HaKadoshim. So, therefore, when it's on his forehead, Al Metzach, when it's on his forehead, v'Nosa. So only when he's wearing it, not when he's not wearing it. But Rabbi Shimon Savar, he says, no. The pasuk says further. The end of the pasuk says, "V'ayal mitzchot tomid l'rotzon lifnei lahem lifnei Hashem." It says that it should be "V'ayal mitzchot tomid l'rotzon lahem lifnei Hashem." It should be on his forehead always, always, to gain acceptance, to bring acceptance before Hashem. So my tomid, what does it mean tomid? Does it mean? Could it possibly mean that the Kohen Gadol wears the tzitz all the time? It can't mean that he wears it all the time. So me mishkachas law. Is that possible? Miloi boy moil basic kisei. He sometimes has to go to the basic kisei. He can't wear the tzitz when he's going to the basic kisei. Miloi boy noim. Sometimes he has to go to sleep. He can't wear it when he's going to sleep. So it can't mean literally that to learn it that way, via mitzvah tomid, that it's always on his forehead. So how do we interpret it? Ella tomid meratzahu. Elamai, what it means rather is that not Bahaya al Mitzvah Tomid, that he's always wearing the tzitz. He can't be always wearing the tzitz. So we read it that we say Bahaya al Mitzvah, stop. Tomid l'rotz l'fnei Hashem. It'll always gain acceptance, meaning whether he's wearing it or not, it'll gain acceptance. So you read the Tomid as part of the next part of the pasuk, Tomid Meratz. So it's Tomid Ravaya Mitzvah, stop. Tomid L'Ratz, and it's always Meratza. So you see from here whether he's wearing it or not, it is Meratza. Well, Rabbi Yehuda, it says Tomid. How does he explain Tomid? So how does he explain to say that if it's not Tomid Meratza, how does he explain the Tomid? So it can't mean that he wears it all the time. So what does Talmud mean? It means it means that the Kohen should never have ha'esach hadas. He should never divert his attention. He has to remind himself of it. So therefore, he keeps it in his mind. He touches it to make sure that he always is thinking about it. So how to shlach datim mena? Rabbi Bar Huna. Talmud Rabbi Bar Huna. A person, similarly, we learn that from the tzitz, that the tzitz has the Shem Hashem written on it, that tefillin has the parashiyos with the name of Hashem, the Shem Hashem, and similarly, we learn out from the tzitz that a person should also not have hesach hadas from tefillin, and therefore he should be memashmish tzimchol shoy. He should be constantly touching it to remind himself that he has the tefillin, and he should not divert his attention from it. Kal v'chaymer b'tzitz, and we learn out a kal v'chaymer from the tzitz. What's the kal v'chaymer matzitz? Shem Weller's karachas. The tzitz only has the Shem Hashem written once. On the front of it is the Shem Hashem. Amra Torah. Nevertheless, the Torah says al mitzvah tomid. It says al mitzvah tomid shelo yaseh daita mimena, that he should not divert his attention from it. Tefillin sheyesh behem askoras harbe. The tefillin has the parshiyos that have several mentioning of the Hashem name, Allah's kama v'kama. So certainly it's written that Shem Hashem more than by the tzitz, Allah's kama v'kama, that he should not divert his attention from it, and therefore he should be touching mimash yadai to make sure that he remembers that he has a tefillin and not have hesech adas. Now one could ask, even though the tzitz has kedusha, it has more kedusha than the tefillin, but nevertheless, as far as the Shem Hashem, as far as the Shem Hashem, there are more askoras in the tefillin than by the tzitz. So Isis asks, even as far as the Shem Hashem is concerned, but still, what's the kal v'chaymer from the tzitz? The tzitz, the Shem Hashem, is written on the outside, and the tefillin is concealed in the inside. And on the tzitz, it's Yud Kei Vav Kei. The tefillin, and on the outside, it doesn't have the Shem Hashem. And even if you want to say it has the knots, the kshorim, that have the shin and the shakai, the shin daled yud, but me'ikar medaraisa, it's only the shin. And even then, it's shakai, it's not the shem of yud for isi, it's not yud kei vav kei. So really, even as far as the Shem Hashem is concerned, really, what would be the kal v'chaymer from the tzitz? Taisa says it's not a kal v'chaymer gomer. It's midrabanan. The Rabbanan made the churma to be that we memashmesh with tefillin, and that's the mice of what we do in Krishma. We touch the tefillin and we keep our mind on it. It's not me'ikar din, it's not a kal v'chamer gomer, but there's a makam over here that since in a certain respect, in a certain area, tefillin has this chumrah that it has Hashem Hashem written more times than by the tzitz. There's a makam to make this chumrah that if we have this din by the tzitz, then we should have this din by the tefillin as well.